Beneath a restless moon, the desert lay hushed, its wide silence broken only by the whisper of wind threading through dry sage. A young woman moved like a shadow against the earth, her bare feet striking stone and thorn, blood marking each hurried step. The air trembled with the echo of drums in the distance, drums that spoke not of celebration, but of pursuit. She had fled them, fled the man whose hand felt like a rope around her throat, whose promise of marriage was a sentence carved in cruelty. The land itself seemed to lean close to her struggle. Owls circled low, coyotes tracked from afar. The stars flickered as if torn between watching and turning away. Still she ran, heart pounding like the hooves of 1,000 horses, every breath a vow that she would rather die in the desert than live bound to him. Her veil, once pure in ceremony, now hung torn, clinging to her sweat-damp hair. Each strand of black shimmered beneath the moonlight, her face streaked with dust and defiance. Memory stung her eyes more sharply than the grit. How the people had watched when he placed his claim upon her, their silence sharper than any blade. She had pleaded, voice trembling like a sparrow's wing, but no one had spoken. No hand had lifted for her. Only the cruel smile of her groom, a man with a heart hardened like old iron, who saw her not as flesh and spirit, but as a trophy chained to his name. He carried wealth, horses, cattle, and the authority of fear, but not once had he carried kindness. In that moment, with the chance of binding echoing, she had sworn to herself that no ceremony, no threat, no tradition could cage the storm of her will. She had waited until nightfall, when even the cruel must close their eyes, and slipped into darkness with nothing but her breath and the strength of her own defiance. Now the ground tore at her feet, the desert claiming its price for her rebellion. Her lungs burned, her throat dry as bone. She stumbled through brush and stone, whispering prayers to the old spirits, unsure whether they listened or turned their backs. With each faltering step she thought of the man she escaped, his shadow reaching for her across the distance. The thought nearly broke her. But somewhere deeper than despair lived a steady flame, the belief that beyond this night, beyond this pursuit, lay something she had never known, freedom. It was at a bend in the canyon where the land dipped toward a quiet creek that her body finally yielded. She collapsed near the water's edge, palms pressed into cool soil, chest heaving like a wounded bird. For a moment she thought the spirits had come to claim her, for a faint glow wavered in the darkness, moving closer, pulsing like a lantern through fog. She pressed her body low, heart frantic. The glow belonged not to spirits, but to a rider. His horse moved with a slow, steady gait, the lantern hooked to the saddle, swaying with rhythm. He was broad of shoulder, yet there was no violence in the way he rode. He dismounted without haste, boots pressing soft against the earth, eyes adjusting to the shadow that was her broken form. She tried to drag herself back, but her limbs refused her. She could only stare as he drew near, his face half shadow, half light. He knelt a short distance away, careful not to close the gap too swiftly. His voice was quiet, steady, carrying no command. "Do you wish me to help?" That was all. No hand forced upon her arm, no assumption of right. Only a question, given freely, waiting for her to answer. She could not form words, but her silence tilted toward surrender. He read the language of her exhaustion and lowered himself onto one knee, setting the lantern down so its glow warmed the ground between them. From a pouch at his side, he pulled a strip of cloth, clean and plain, and without touching her, showed it to her first, as if to ask permission. When she did not resist, he wrapped it around her torn foot with careful precision, his hands large yet moving, as though they cradled glass. By the time he finished binding the wounds, her head had tipped forward, heavy with fatigue. He built a small fire nearby, not roaring, only enough to push back the night's bite. She watched him through half-lidded eyes, studying the way he moved, without rush, without arrogance. His silence was not the silence of cruelty, but of patience, like a river waiting to be crossed. They shared no words for a long while. She sat wrapped in her own breath, the fire's glow painting her face in soft light, while he leaned back against his saddle, gaze lifted toward stars. She wondered if he knew what danger he placed himself in by simply being near her. Yet he seemed untroubled, as though the weight of her world did not frighten him. Her heart, still trembling from a chase, began to settle in this rare quiet. She had known men who used words as knives, promises as chains. But this stranger's quiet question echoed louder than any vow she had heard. "Do you wish me to help?" Not once in her life had anyone asked what she wished. The drums in the distance had faded, though she knew they would return. The cruel groom would not release her so easily. But in this small circle of firelight, she felt the first breath of safety touch her. The kind that does not come from walls or weapons, but from presence alone. When she finally closed her eyes, sleep taking her into its fragile hold, the cowboy did not look away from the fire. He kept watch, lantern steady, as though guarding more than just a rest. And in the hush of that desert night, where spirits whispered through the wind and coyotes cried from afar, she dreamed not of chains, but of a freedom she had barely begun to believe in. Yet even as dawn threatened the horizon, shadows stirred along the canyon walls. Shapes shifted where no man should walk, voices echoed where no breath should linger. The desert had not finished testing her flight, nor the man who now chose to stand beside her. Something more than her cruel groom had caught her trail, and before the sun rose, she would learn whether this stranger's gentleness could endure against the spirits that hunted in silence. The night stretched wide and endless, the desert carrying them forward beneath a sky stitched with stars. The cowboy's horse bore her weight with patience, hooves pressing into soft earth while he walked beside, one hand holding the reins, the other brushing dust from his hat brim. She sat upon the saddle with shoulders hunched, every muscle still trembling, but her eyes were alive, darting to the shadows as if they might suddenly grow teeth. He said nothing, yet his presence was anchor enough, steady as stone, and in that silence she found a fragile calm. She studied him between the rise and fall of her breath. His frame carried years of labor, ropes, storms, endless miles of trail, but his face held none of the hardness she had come to know in men. There was weariness, yes, but beneath it lived a quiet that felt unthreatening, like the cool shade of a cottonwood at midday. She wondered if he understood what danger he had stepped into simply by leading her away, if he knew the cruel groom's riders would not rest until she was found. And yet he walked with the calm of one who had already chosen his place. The desert air shifted, carrying whispers that did not belong to wind. She heard them first in fragments, broken syllables of her people's tongue, words that should not have been spoken here, at this hour, by voices without breath. Her fingers tightened around the horse's mane. He caught her unease, glanced at her, then at the darkness curling along the ridge. His eyes sharpened, not fearful but aware, as though he had walked through strangeness before. When he spoke, it was soft. "Not all spirits wish us harm, but some do." Her heart faltered at the knowing in his voice. She had grown among stories of spirits, those who guard, those who punish, those who wander restlessly between. But she had not expected them to walk her path tonight. As if answering thought, shadows swelled across the horizon, figures without form shifting where no man stood. Coyotes sat upon the ridge with eyes that glowed too brightly, unblinking, unnatural. An owl circled low, its wings stretching wider than any owl should bear. The night had thickened into something watching. The cowboy reached for her hand then, not with demand, but with the quiet assurance of one who understood that fear could be softened by touch. His palm was calloused, firm, but he did not grip. He let her decide whether to hold or pull away. She held. The heat of his skin grounded her against the chill of unseen eyes. A storm rose without warning. Trees bent though no wind carried them, the ground humming beneath their boots. From the dark split a creature unlike anything she had known, half wolf, half shadow, its form rippling as though smoke had found bones. Eyes burned red within its shape, fixing upon her with hunger sharpened by something older than man's cruelty. Her breath fractured. The cowboy stepped forward, body between her and the thing, his pistol raised. But the weapon seemed a poor shield against what bled from the other world. His jaw tightened, yet his voice remained level. "Stay behind me." She clutched his arm, her lips spilling chants her grandmother once taught in whispers by fire. The words carried no certainty, only hope, But in her mouth they became plea and defiance all at once. Together they stood, steel in his hand, prayer on her tongue. The creature snarled, the sound both animal and wind-tearing wood. For a moment it seemed the desert itself would split. Then, as if measured by their combined will, the beast retreated into shadow, dissolving back into the storm from which it had crawled. Silence fell sudden and sharp, broken only by the ragged rhythm of their breathing. Dawn arrived pale, washing the land with light too fragile to believe the night's terror had been real. They sat by the dying fire, her knees drawn to her chest, his hat resting upon his knee. For the first time since meeting him, she spoke without hesitation. She told him of the cruel groom, of the way his gaze claimed rather than cherished, of the silence of her people when she begged for escape. Each word left her throat raw, as though torn from a wound not yet healed. He listened. Not once did he interrupt, nor shape his face into pity. His eyes remained lowered, steady upon the fire, as if to let her speak into the air without the weight of being stared at. The more she spoke, the lighter her chest felt, though tears slid unbidden. When silence came again, it was not hollow, but filled with something new. She had been heard. She had been seen, and not as weak, but as a woman who had chosen courage in the face of despair. He reached for a piece of bread from his saddlebag, offering it to her as though it were an unspoken vow. Here, you need strength, and I will share mine. She accepted, and in that small act, trust deepened like a seed finding soil. The morning stretched, but unease lingered. She wondered why the spirits had shown themselves with such fury, why they had sought her path as though to test it. Perhaps it was her rebellion that stirred them, or perhaps they were bound to the cruel groom, feeding on the chains he had tried to place upon her. Whatever their reason, she knew the desert would not easily release her. Yet when she looked at the man beside her, watching the horizon with eyes sharp as hawks but calm as river stone, she felt the smallest sliver of safety take root. The world might hurl spirits and shadows, storms and cruelty, but here was one soul who did not see her as possession or burden. He saw her simply as she was. Still, the drums had not died. From the far reaches of land came the faint beat of pursuit, steady as a war cry swallowed by distance. They both heard it. She stiffened, the bread in her hand turning heavy as stone. His jaw set, eyes narrowing toward the sound. He rose slowly, dusting his hands, voice low but firm. They will not stop. Not yet. His gaze shifted to hers, steady as an oath unspoken. But neither will I. Her breath caught at the finality in his tone. She realized then that this journey was no longer hers alone. Whatever hunted her, man or spirit, now hunted them both. And though part of her trembled with fear for what danger she had brought upon him, another part, deep and aching, found solace in the thought that she would no longer face it alone. But as she turned her face toward the east, the light revealed a shape on the canyon ridge, tall, unmoving, a silhouette that did not vanish with the wind. Her cruel groom had found the trail, and beside his figure, too still to be mere shadow, stood forms that belonged to no living man at all. The ridge loomed like a scar across the dawn, light crawling along its edge, as though reluctant to reveal what waited there. She saw him first, the cruel groom, broad-shouldered, his figure stiff as stone. He had found the trail, as she always feared he would. Around him clustered riders, men loyal not by love, but by fear, their silhouettes sharp against the sky. And beside them lingered shapes less human, shadows stretched wrong, heads bowed though no wind pressed them, eyes flickering faintly as coals. Her breath faltered, the taste of ash filling her mouth though no fire burned. The cowboy stood at her side, his stance still and unshaken, as if he had expected this meeting all along. He did not move toward his pistol yet, nor lift his lantern, but watched with eyes narrowing against the sun. His silence steadied her, though her own heart beat as if it would tear itself free. She wanted to speak, to warn him of the danger her people's spirits carried, but her voice withered. Instead, she grasped the edge of his coat, as though to anchor herself in this fragile moment before the storm broke. The riders began their descent, hooves echoing against stone, stirring a dust that hung like smoke. The cruel groom rode ahead, his face half hidden by shadow, but his presence as sharp as a knife. He had always carried himself with the certainty of one who believed the world belonged to him, who believed women were property to claim, not souls to honor. She felt the old terror rise again, that suffocating grip of chains, invisible yet crushing. But then the cowboy's hand touched hers, small, unspoken grounding. His skin rough from labor, his touch as steady as earth. With that, the fear shifted, loosening its claws. When the riders reached the canyon floor, silence pressed heavy, broken only by the restless snorts of horses. The groom's gaze cut into her, then to the cowboy, his lips curving in a smile without warmth. He called out, voice carrying across the distance like a whip's crack, promising punishment, demanding her return. But she heard more than his words. She heard the spirits murmuring at his side, their whispers feeding his pride, urging him to bind her tighter than before. Her knees trembled, yet her will held. She had not fled into the night only to bow beneath his shadow again. The cowboy stepped forward, his boots pressing dust into the earth. His voice, calm but unyielding, carried across the canyon. She will not return to chains. His words were plain, without flourish, yet each landed heavier than the groom's shouts. The groom laughed, cruel and hollow, mocking the stranger who dared stand between him and his prize. He raised his hand, and the riders shifted, weapons glinting. The shadows stirred too, their forms growing denser, the air thick with their hunger. For a moment it seemed violence would spill, that the canyon would drown in blood and ash. The cowboy drew his pistol, but he did not fire. Instead he stood firm, waiting. The woman, breath ragged, felt a surge of clarity. She realized the choice was not his to make, nor the groom's, nor the spirit's, but hers. Her voice, long buried beneath silence, rose like a cry torn from stone. She stepped from behind the cowboy, her figure small yet unbroken, her eyes locked upon the groom. "I will not return," she said, the words cutting sharper than any blade. "I am not yours." The canyon seemed to pause. Even the horses stilled, ears twitching as though the earth itself listened. The groom's face twisted, disbelief curdling into rage. He spurred his horse forward, but as he moved, the shadows stirred strangely. Instead of surging with him, they recoiled, their whispers rising into shrieks. It was as if her defiance had cracked their tether, her courage shattering the hold they once claimed. The spirits swirled about the groom, clawing at his figure, twisting the air until he fought not the cowboy, but the very forces he thought to command. The cowboy pulled her back just as the groom's horse reared, eyes wild. The man shouted, cursing, but the shadows consumed him, his riders scattering in panic. Dust rose, screams echoed, then silence fell again, heavy, absolute. The ridge stood empty save for the fading shiver of wind. Where the groom had been, nothing remained but a hollow echo. She collapsed to her knees, trembling not from fear, but from release. For the first time, the chains inside her chest loosened fully. The cowboy knelt beside her, his arms steady around her shoulders, not claiming her, but holding space for her to breathe. She turned to him, searching his face, finding only quiet certainty in his eyes. He had not saved her with gun or blade, but by standing steady enough for her to claim her own freedom. They did not speak for some time. The desert itself seemed to breathe easier, the air clearer, the sunlight warmer, as if the land approved of what had been done. When at last he stood, he extended his hand, not as command, not as demand, but as invitation. She placed her palm in his, rising with the strength that had always been hers. The days that followed carried them toward gentler country, where grass grew and rivers sang more kindly. They built no grand ceremony, called no crowd. One morning, as dawn brushed gold across the hills, he wove a ring of wildflowers, placing it softly upon her hand. His vow was simple, whispered like a prayer. "I will honor you as long as I breathe." She felt no chain in it, only freedom, only choice. For the first time in her life, she belonged not to another's will but to herself, and she chose him. Their days unfolded quietly, built upon small kindnesses. He tended fire while she prepared bread. She mended cloth while he cared for the horse. Their laughter came slowly, uncertain at first, then steady, like water carving stone. What had begun as survival grew into something deeper, a bond not of need, but of recognition. He had seen her as more than a runaway bride, more than a shadow of fear. He had seen her as a woman brave enough to stand against cruelty and claim her life. Yet peace never lingers forever on the frontier. Some nights, when the fire dwindled low, she felt the air shift, whispers brushing the edge of her dreams. The spirits had not vanished entirely. They lingered in the corners of land and memory, watching, waiting. She would wake to his steady breathing beside her, the rhythm anchoring her back to the present. Still, she knew the desert did not release souls so easily. On one such night, as the wind pressed against the cabin walls and the moon cast silver shadows across their floor, she heard a faint sound beyond the door, drums, distant, pulsing like a heartbeat in the earth. Her breath caught, her hand curling around his. He stirred awake, eyes meeting hers in the dim glow, and for a moment neither spoke. The past had not finished its pursuit.